The brass key refused to turn. Harper twisted it again, pushing her weight against the heavy mahogany door of her Brookline townhouse. The lock held firm, emitting a dull, unfamiliar metallic clunk. She stepped back, her breath catching in the climate-controlled stillness of the corridor. Lined up perfectly against the floral wallpaper were her 3 designer suitcases. Beside them sat a heavy cardboard banker box, its lid bulging over 7 years of her meticulously filed tax returns. Her stomach plummeted as the reality of the scene registered in her tired mind. This was her home, the sanctuary she had poured every ounce of her salary into renovating. She reached for the handle again, but the door suddenly unlatched from the inside. It opened just 3 inches. Held firmly by a solid brass chain, Julian's face appeared in the narrow gap. His expression completely devoid of emotion. He did not look like the man she had been married to for 3 years. He looked down at the hallway runner, refusing to meet her eyes. He told her it was over and that it would be best for everyone if she did not make a scene. Harper stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the flat, corporate tone of his voice. She asked him what he was talking about, her voice trembling as she pressed her hand against the door. Before Julian could answer, a shadow moved in the warmly lit foyer behind him. Eleanor stepped into view, holding a crystal wineglass with an air of effortless superiority. Her mother-in-law was dressed in her usual cashmere and pearls, looking entirely at home in the foyer Harper had paid to remodel. Eleanor took a slow sip of her Pinot Noir, her eyes cold and patronizing. She looked at Harper through the crack in the door and sighed a deeply theatrical, pitying sigh. Eleanor said it was time to be realistic. Darling, because this condo was never really yours to begin with. Julian's posture shifted, emboldened by his mother's presence. Ah, cruel. Almost giddy smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He turned his head over his shoulder and called out cheerfully that she was leaving for good. Then he looked back at Harper, gave a polite nod, and shut the door firmly in her face. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a sickeningly final sound. Harper stared at the brass numerals on the door, completely unable to breathe. The silence of the affluent hallway pressed in on her from all sides. This was a building where fortunes were quietly managed and scandals were buried under layers of polite smiles. A floorboard creaked near the staircase to her right. Barb, the president of the homeowner association, was slowly ascending the carpeted steps. Barb was clutching a woven tote bag, her eyes darting greedily between Harper and the luggage on the floor. She paused on the landing, her face arranged in a mask of passive-aggressive concern. Barb tilted her head and asked if everything was all right. Noting aloud that the hallway was simply not a storage area, Harper swallowed the lump of panic in her throat and tried to project normalcy. She lied and said she was just organizing some things for a work trip. Barb offered a tight, unconvinced smile, her gaze lingering on the cardboard box of financial documents. She casually mentioned that it was quite a busy day for Harper's unit, adding that a blonde realtor had been visiting Julian all afternoon. Barb adjusted her sweater and added that she hoped they were not considering putting the unit on the market without consulting the board first. Harper felt the blood drain from her face at the mention of a realtor. She managed a polite nod, waited for Barb's footsteps to fade down the hall, and sank against the wall. She had no coat, no keys, and suddenly, no home. By midnight, Harper was staring at the water-stained ceiling of a cramped apartment in Somerville. She was lying on a lumpy fabric sofa in the living room of her best friend, Chloe. The ambient noise of the busy street outside was jarring compared to the insulated silence of Brookline. Chloe had asked no questions, simply tossing a blanket over Harper and setting a glass of water on the coffee table. Harper's phone vibrated violently against the cheap wood of the table. The bright screen illuminated the dark room, showing a new text message from Julian. She unlocked the screen with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the sterile, perfectly punctuated paragraph. Julian wrote that they needed to handle this civilly. As adults, he stated that he was requesting her immediate cooperation in signing away her equity in the property. The text went on to mention a promissory note, capitalizing both words as if it were an undeniable legal threat. Julian claimed she owed his mother a $50,000 down payment from the initial purchase of the townhouse. He wrote that if she signed the quitclaim deed by Friday, his mother might forgive the debt. Harper sat up, the thin blanket falling to the floor. She was a certified public accountant, A woman whose entire career was built on tracing numbers and exposing financial inconsistencies. There was no $50,000 loan from Eleanor. Harper had saved that money herself. Pulling, grueling 60-hour weeks during tax season for 4 consecutive years. She read the text again. Her confusion rapidly crystallizing into absolute terror. They were not just kicking her out of her marriage. They were systematically erasing her financial existence. The next morning, the gray skies over Boston mirrored the heavy dread in Harper's chest. She walked into the imposing marble lobby of her bank. Her designer heels clicking faintly on the polished stone. She approached the teller window, handed over her driver license, and asked for a complete printed summary of her accounts. The teller, a young woman with a brass nameplate, typed briskly on her keyboard. The typing stopped abruptly. The teller shifted in her seat, her brow furrowing as she clicked her mouse a few more times. She looked up at Harper with an uncomfortable, apologetic expression. The teller stated that she was sorry, but Harper's access to the joint checking and savings accounts had been revoked the previous afternoon. Harper gripped the edge of the marble counter, her knuckles turning white. She kept her voice even. Leaning closer to the glass partition, she explained that her entire paycheck was directly deposited into that checking account every 2 weeks. The teller swallowed hard and pointed to her monitor, explaining that the primary account holders, Julian and Eleanor, had executed a complete withdrawal. The balance was 0. Harper felt a cold sweat break out along her hairline. She asked the teller to pull up the mortgage documents for the Brookline townhouse, citing her right to see them as the homeowner. The teller typed for another minute, the silence stretching out like a physical weight in the cavernous bank. When the young woman spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. She gently informed Harper that her name was nowhere on the mortgage or the property deed. The townhouse was legally registered entirely in the names of Julian and his mother. The floor seemed to drop out from under Harper's feet. She remembered the day of the closing. 3 years ago. In a bright, sunny lawyer office, Eleanor had poured champagne, hovering over the paperwork, insisting that she had structured the deed to save them from a massive tax burden. Harper had been young, deeply in love, and naive enough to trust her new family. She walked out of the bank in a total daze. The cold wind cutting through her thin blouse. Her life savings were gone. Every dollar she had earned for the last 3 years had been quietly funneled into an asset she did not legally own. She checked her purse and realized she had exactly $14 in cash to her name. She could not afford a lawyer, let alone a morning coffee. When she returned to Chloe's apartment, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Chloe was pacing the small kitchen, holding her phone away from her ear as if it were on fire. She looked at Harper, her eyes wide with disbelief and anger. Chloe ended the call and tossed her phone onto the counter. She told Harper that Eleanor had just spent the last hour calling everyone in their social circle. The smear campaign was moving with terrifying efficiency. Eleanor had called Harper's parents in Ohio, sobbing softly, claiming Harper had suffered a mental break. Eleanor had told Barb from the homeowner association that Harper had been secretly embezzling money from Julian's modest trust fund. The wealthy Brookline matriarch was spinning a flawless narrative of a tragic, unstable daughter-in-law. She was painting Harper as a desperate thief who had to be quietly removed for her own good. Then, Chloe's phone buzzed again with a text message. It was from a mutual friend who worked at Harper's accounting firm. The message warned that a pair of extremely aggressive lawyers had just called the managing partner. They had strongly suggested the firm audit Harper's client files, heavily implying she was a liability to their corporate reputation. Harper collapsed onto a bar stool, burying her face in her hands. Eleanor was not just taking the house and the money. She was burning the bridge, the roads, and the entire city behind her, ensuring Harper would have zero credibility if she ever tried to speak up. It was a masterclass in psychological and financial destruction. Harper sat in silence for a long time, letting the utter devastation wash over her. But as the afternoon faded into a bleak evening, the paralysis began to lift. She was not a socialite, nor was she a trust fund beneficiary who relied on manipulation. She was a certified public accountant. She lived in the world of ledgers, routing numbers, and paper trails. Harper stood up slowly and walked over to the corner of the living room. She looked down at the heavy cardboard banker box she had dragged out of the hallway. It was the only possession she had managed to grab besides her clothes. She sat cross-legged on the floor, pulled off the lid, and breathed in the scent of old paper and ink. She began pulling out thick manila folders, spreading them across Chloe's worn rug. For 4 hours, Harper did not speak, did not eat, and barely blinked. She traced every bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, and every cash check from the last 7 years. Julian and Eleanor had hidden the legal ownership, but they had made one catastrophic, arrogant mistake. They had let Harper do all the administrative grunt work. She found the physical carbon copy of the cashier check used for the $50,000 down payment. It clearly displayed her maiden name as the remitter, drawn directly from her personal, premarital savings account. She found 72 consecutive months of printed bank statements. Every single statement highlighted a transfer from her specific payroll deposit into the joint account, matching the exact dollar amount of the mortgage payment 3 days later. She had the forensic proof that she had funded the entire existence of that house. The paper trail was flawless, irrefutable, and physically in her hands. A cold, unfamiliar sense of purpose settled into Harper's chest. She carefully organized the files back into the box, her mind shifting from panic to calculation. The next morning, Harper borrowed Chloe's beat-up sedan and drove back to Brookline. She parked down the street from her townhouse, keeping a careful watch on the driveway. At exactly 10 in the morning, a pristine white Range Rover glided up to the curb. A tall, striking blonde woman stepped out, adjusting the lapels of a sharp designer suit. It was Sloane, the luxury realtor Barb had mentioned in the hallway. Sloane retrieved a pristine leather clipboard from the passenger seat and confidently walked up the manicured path to Harper's front door. Harper got out of the sedan and walked briskly up the driveway, intercepting the realtor just as she reached for the doorbell. Harper called out Sloane's name, her voice steady and echoing slightly in the quiet suburban air. Sloane paused, turning around with a perfectly practiced, welcoming smile, but as her eyes registered Harper's face, the smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound annoyance. Sloane sighed, adjusted her grip on her clipboard, and looked Harper up and down with icy disdain. She told Harper that she really should not be here. As it was trespassing at this point, Harper stepped onto the porch, invading Sloane's personal space just enough to make her shift her weight. Harper stated very clearly that she had paid the mortgage on this property for 3 years and that the sale was fraudulent. Sloane let out a short, patronizing laugh, shaking her head as if dealing with a confused child. She leaned in slightly, her expensive perfume overwhelmingly sweet. Sloane whispered that the deed in the county database told a very different story. And the county database was the only thing that mattered. The realtor tapped a manicured fingernail against her clipboard. She advised Harper to take whatever severance Julian was offering and disappear before Eleanor decided to truly ruin her life. Sloane turned her back, punched a security code into the electronic lock, and stepped inside the townhouse. The heavy mahogany door shut in Harper's face for the second time in 3 days. But this time, Harper did not panic. She walked back to the borrowed sedan, her mind racing with a new piece of the puzzle. Sloane was far too confident, far too deeply embedded in Eleanor's operation to just be a casual real estate agent. This was a well-oiled machine. Late that night, Harper was back on Chloe's lumpy couch, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The soft glow of the street lamp outside cast long, haunting shadows across the wall. Her phone vibrated silently on her chest. She picked it up and saw a text message from a number she did not recognize. The message consisted of 3 short sentences. It told her not to believe the promissory note. It said the document was forged, and that the sender knew exactly how they did it. Harper sat up immediately, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She pressed the call button on the unknown number and lifted the phone to her ear. The line rang twice before clicking open. For a long moment, there was only the sound of shaky, shallow breathing on the other end. Harper spoke into the darkness, asking who was there. A woman's voice answered, her tone thick with years of accumulated fear and exhaustion. The woman said her name was Rachel, and that she was Julian's first wife. The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Rachel took a deep breath and whispered that Harper was not the first one they had done this to. She said that Eleanor had been running this trap for a very long time. Rachel's voice cracked in the dark as she delivered her final warning. She told Harper that if she did not fight back, she would end up exactly like her. The line went dead, leaving only the dull, rhythmic hum of the city traffic drifting through the thin living room window. Harper sat frozen on the cramped sofa. The phone was still pressed against her cheek. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums. A frantic, echoing rhythm that slowly began to steady. The suffocating confusion that had drowned her for the past 48 hours evaporated. In its place, a freezing, absolute clarity took hold. She was not a victim of a sudden, tragic misunderstanding. She was the target of a perfectly calculated financial execution. And she was not the first. For 7 years, Harper had made her living finding the hidden truths in ledgers. She hunted down discrepancies for breakfast. She dismantled corporate fraud for sport. Eleanor and Julian had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed Harper would simply wither away in shame. Paralyzed by the social stigma of a Brookline eviction, they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot she was a certified public accountant. And now, the weeping, broken wife was gone. The auditor had arrived. The next morning, the sky over Boston was the color of bruised iron. Harper drove her sedan out of the pristine, manicured streets of her former neighborhood and deep into the industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast was physically jarring. The sprawling lawns and Georgian brick facades of the affluent suburbs vanished. They were replaced by cracked asphalt, chain-link fences, and towering, weathered apartment buildings. Harper pulled into a cramped parking lot behind a towering concrete structure. She turned off the engine and gripped the steering wheel. Taking one slow, measured breath, Rachel opened her apartment door only a few inches at first. The heavy security chain remained firmly in place. Harper saw a pale face, dark circles carved deep beneath exhausted eyes, and a posture hunched defensive against the world. Harper spoke her own name softly, keeping her hands visible. The chain rattled, sliding free, and the door opened to reveal Julian's first wife. Rachel looked 10 years older than she actually was. The apartment behind her was impeccably clean but desperately bare. There was no art on the walls. The furniture was secondhand and mismatched. This was the ghost of Julian's past, living in the financial ruins Eleanor had left behind. Rachel poured 2 mugs of cheap instant coffee and sat across from Harper at a wobbly kitchen table. She did not waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was raspy, stripped of any warmth. She explained the exact mechanism of the trap. It always happened at the family summer house in Cape Cod. Eleanor would wait for a quiet Sunday morning. She would slide a stack of mundane tax documents across the patio table. She would use that honeyed, patronizing tone, calling it routine family estate planning. She would point to the bottom line, rushing the signature, talking over the moment with pleasant country club gossip. Harper felt the blood drain from her face. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was a humid July morning 3 years ago. Eleanor had poured her a mimosa. The ocean breeze had been blowing through the screened porch. Eleanor had presented a single sheet of paper, buried in a folder of joint tax returns. She had said it was just a formality for the trust. Harper had signed it without reading the fine print. She had trusted her mother-in-law. She had trusted her husband, who sat right there, sipping coffee and smiling his empty close. Agreeable smile. Rachel leaned forward, her hollow eyes locking onto Harper. She explained that the document was entirely blank above the signature line. Eleanor kept those blank, signed pages in a safety deposit box. When the time was right, when Julian had extracted enough of his wife's income, Eleanor took the blank page to a boutique printing shop. She printed the forged promissory note directly over the original signature. She backdated the debt. Suddenly, the unsuspecting wife owed Eleanor $50,000, or $100,000, effectively wiping out any claim to the shared real estate. Rachel slid a small, silver flash drive across the scratched wooden table. It clicked softly against the wood. She told Harper that this was the real prize. It had taken Rachel years to track it down. The drive contained every illegal deed transfer facilitated by Sloan, the luxury real estate agent. Sloan was not just selling houses. She was the architect of the asset laundering. Rachel explained that Sloan was saved in Eleanor's phone under the contact name estate lawyer. It was a closed-loop system of fraud, designed to bleed working women dry to fund Julian's lifestyle. Rachel then wrote down a phone number on a scrap of paper. It was the contact information for Fiona, the second wife. Harper called Fiona from the parking lot. Unlike Rachel, Fiona was not entirely broken. Fiona was angry. When they met later that afternoon at a noisy diner off the interstate, Fiona practically vibrated with unresolved rage. She was still paying off $30,000 in fraudulent debt from Eleanor's schemes 8 years ago. Fiona had the aggressive, the hardened edge of a woman who had spent nearly a decade surviving on sheer spite. When Harper laid out the flash drive and the forensic evidence of the backdated ink, Fiona did not cry. She smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. The kind of smile that promised absolute ruin. The three women formed an invisible, unbreakable alliance right there in a corner booth smelling of stale coffee and fried food. They were the discarded assets of the Brookline matriarch. But Eleanor had made a fatal error. She had left them alive. And Harper knew exactly where to strike. Eleanor did not care about money. She had plenty of it. Eleanor cared about social currency. She cared about the homeowner association hierarchy. She cared about her immaculate, untouchable reputation at the country club. They were not going to sue Eleanor in a quiet courtroom. They were going to publicly crucify her in front of everyone she respected. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later. Harper had returned to her friend Chloe's apartment after a long shift at the accounting firm. A familiar, expensive silver sedan was idling by the curb. Julian stepped out. He wore his signature tailored navy suit. His hair was perfectly styled. He looked like a man who had not lost a single night of sleep. He approached Harper on the sidewalk. Looking nervously at the crumbling brick buildings around them, he cleared his throat and deployed his weaponized corporate speak. He said they needed to handle this civilly. He said his mother thought it was best to offer a small transition fund, just to keep things clean. Julian pulled a pristine white envelope from his inner jacket pocket. He held it out to Harper. He offered her $15,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away forever. He used the word generous. He actually had the audacity to call the theft of her life savings a generous severance package. Harper did not take the envelope. She simply stared at him. For the first time, she truly saw the man she had married. He was not a partner. He was a parasite. He was a spineless, empty vessel who relied entirely on his mother's wealth to shield him from the consequences of his own existence. Harper stepped closer to him. The air between them dropped by 10 degrees. She kept her voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of emotion. She told him to put the money away. She told him he was a pathetic, weak little boy wearing a man's suit. Julian blinked, physically stepping back as if she had struck him. His polite, evasive mask cracked, revealing the panicked coward underneath. Harper leaned in slightly and whispered that she would not be taking his mother's hush money. She promised him she would be delivering her own gift at Eleanor's 60th birthday dinner this coming weekend. She turned and walked up the steps, leaving him standing frozen on the dirty sidewalk. Saturday night arrived with the suffocating humidity of late summer. Eleanor's 60th birthday dinner was being held at the crown jewel of the neighborhood, the Brookline Country Club. It was an expansive, private dining hall dripping with crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive perfume. The room was packed with 50 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the local high society. State senators, real estate developers, and the pearl-clutching heads of the homeowner association were all in attendance. Eleanor sat at the head of a massive mahogany table. She wore a tailored white silk dress, looking every bit the benevolent, intouchable matriarche. Julian sat to her right, sipping an expensive scotch, though his eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak doors. Just as the waitstaff began pouring the vintage champagne for the first toast, the heavy oak doors swung open. The polite hum of aristocratic chatter died instantly. Harper walked into the dining hall. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray business suit. Her posture was flawless. Her face was an unreadable mask of absolute authority. But the shock did not come from Harper alone. Walking shoulder to shoulder behind her were Rachel and Fiona. The three ghosts of Julian's pathetic life had arrived at the feast. A suffocating, heavy silence crashed down over the room. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Barb, the nosy neighbor, audibly gasped and clutched her wine glass. Eleanor stood up. Her honeyed smile faltered for only a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of polite fury. She told Harper she was trespassing. She demanded the waitstaff call security. Harper did not stop walking. She marched directly to the head of the mahogany table. She pulled a small black digital recorder from her pocket and placed it firmly on the white linen tablecloth. Without a word, she pressed play. The volume was turned all the way up. The crisp, undeniable audio of Eleanor's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The recording was from a voicemail Eleanor had left Rachel 5 years ago. One that Rachel had saved in the darkest corner of her phone. Eleanor's voice dripped with aristocratic malice. The recording played loudly for the entire room to hear. Eleanor was heard telling Rachel that she would crush her. She was heard explaining that Julian's wives were temporary investments, and that she owned the judges in this county. She explicitly bragged about backdating the promissory notes. She called it the idiot tax for girls who married above their station. The recording clicked off. The silence in the dining hall was absolute. It was the sound of a social empire taking its final breath. Before anyone could speak, Fiona stepped forward. She slammed a manila folder down onto the fine china. Rachel stepped up next to her and dropped an identical folder. Harper tossed the third folder directly in front of Julian's shaking hands. Harper's voice sliced through the silent room like a scalpel. She announced that these were the independent forensic audits of the 3 promissory notes. She looked directly into the eyes of the state senator sitting to Eleanor's left. She clearly stated that the ink used to print the debt amounts was analyzed by a certified forensic laboratory. The dates were printed over their signatures years after the fact. It was undeniably, categorically, felony fraud. Julian shattered. The polished, evasive middle manager completely dissolved. He dropped his scotch glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. He fell back into his chair, covered his face with his hands, and began to sob. It was a loud, ugly, pathetic sound. He pointed a trembling finger at his mother. He wailed that she made him do it. He cried that it was all her idea, that she controlled the money, that he never wanted to hurt anyone. He threw his own mother directly under the bus to save himself, proving in front of 50 of the most powerful people in Boston that he was a coward of the highest order. Eleanor stood frozen. The color had completely drained from her pristine face. She looked around the room, seeking out her allies. She looked at Barb. She looked at the country club president. She looked at her wealthy relatives. Every single face stared back at her with profound, unmasked disgust. The high society she had worshipped her entire life was violently rejecting her. They were physically leaning away from her as if she carried a plague. Her immaculate reputation, built over 40 years of passive-aggressive manipulation and carefully curated wealth, evaporated into ash in less than 5 minutes. She was no longer the matriarch. She was a cheap, common criminal. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors swung open one last time. Sloane, the luxury real estate agent, hurried into the room. She was wearing her designer suit, clutching a leather briefcase. She looked panicked, having received an urgent, vague text message from Julian's phone, which Harper had hijacked earlier that evening. Sloane rushed up to the table, completely misreading the room. She loudly announced that she had the emergency transfer deeds ready to finalize the eviction. She stopped dead when she saw Harper, Rachel, and Fiona standing at the head of the table. She looked at the ruined face of Eleanor and the sobbing mess of Julian. Sloane realized instantly she had walked directly into an ambush. Eleanor's brother, a senior partner at a massive corporate law firm, slowly stood up. He walked over to Sloane. He reached out and forcefully pulled the leather briefcase from her hands. He opened it, looked at the fraudulent emergency deeds, and shook his head in absolute disgust. He looked at Eleanor and told her he was calling the authorities immediately. He said he would not let her drag the family name into a federal racketeering charge. Sloane turned and tried to sprint for the heavy oak doors. But two burly country club managers, sensing the catastrophic shift in power, stepped into her path and blocked the exit. The aftermath was swift, methodical, and devastatingly permanent. The police arrived 20 minutes later, escorting a silent, humiliated Eleanor out through the main lobby of the country club in handcuffs. Every member of the homeowner association watched her walk out in disgrace. The forensic evidence, combined with the flash drive Rachel had provided, triggered a massive state investigation. Sloane lost her real estate license permanently and was indicted for dozens of counts of wire fraud. Eleanor was denied bail, her assets frozen by the very judges she had once bragged about owning. Her wealthy relatives formally excommunicated her, leaving her utterly isolated in a cold, concrete cell. Julien, terrified of facing a lengthy prison sentence, eagerly turned state's witness against his own mother. In exchange for avoiding jail time, he legally surrendered his 50% equity in the Brookline luxury condo entirely to Harper. He signed the absolute final transfer papers in a dreary downtown law office. He did not look Harper in the eye. When the ink dried, he packed a single duffel bag and vanished from Massachusetts, entirely stripped of his mother's financial armor, and forced to finally exist in the real world as a penniless, broken man. 1 month later, the crisp autumn air settled over Brookline. Harper stood in the beautifully renovated kitchen of her luxury townhouse. The designer luggage and the cardboard box of tax files were gone. The locks had been permanently changed. The house was entirely hers. Every square inch of the pristine hardwood floors belonged to the certified public accountant who had refused to be erased. The doorbell rang. Harper smiled, walking to the front door and pulling it open. Rachel and Fiona stood on the porch, holding expensive bottles of wine and artisan cheeses. They walked inside, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. 3 survivors, sitting in the heart of the affluent suburbs, drinking wine in the house they had taken back from the monster.